the schedule so that we can go to the next one, Phil. I'd like to introduce Dr. Amanda Shire. She's with the Marion County Health Department, part of the Hazardous Materials Emergency Response Team, and recently out of Purdue. And we're glad to have her, and glad to have her here today, giving us some presentations. Without further ado.
Hello, good afternoon. Again, my name is Dr. Amanda Shire. I'm with the Marion County Public Health Department, and I'm a hazmat specialist. And so this past spring, I was asked to participate and help with a study of LUST incidents, which is not nearly as exciting as it might sound. LUST is standing for Leaking Underground Storage Tanks. And so I'm here to present the results from that study, as well as to kind of convince you why these are important to be aware of. And so first off, why is it important to study these incidents? First off, it's a general public health issue. A lot of it's just simply awareness. Residents and even health departments need to be aware of what's going on in their community. And a lot of the danger for these sites is that it's out of sight and out of mind. It's something that's buried underground. If we don't see it, we tend to forget about it. And so you really have to pay attention to these issues. Of course, there's obviously a lot of environmental impact. These can contaminate soil and groundwater sources, as well as lead to vapor intrusion, both for businesses as well as private residences. And then specific impact we have on well fields, and I'm going to talk about this a lot in this talk, and how LUST incidents and protecting our groundwater and knowing about where our well fields are, those are all directly related, so we have to pay attention. And so obviously water companies, as well as private residences, pull water from rivers, reservoirs, and wells. And us kind of big city folk in Marion County, if you're not in the health department, a lot of people don't even know that we have well fields. And so a lot of it is just basic awareness. And even more recently, this past summer with the drought, there's been a lot more emphasis on drinking water as far as the public is concerned. And so since that's still kind of fresh in our minds, I'm going to use that example on how the drought has impacted the public's perception of drinking water. And so here's some very familiar pictures from around the state. Here's a picture that was seen a lot even on national news. This is our Morse Reservoir up in Noblesville because it's such an important part of the city's water supply. And so when it gets down really low, of course, the water companies become concerned. And then obviously it has a severe impact on our plants, which is such a vital part of our Hoosier economy. And so, well, of course, the drought leads to a lack of rain, and then couple that with an increasing water usage. And so usually with the drought and lack of rain comes severe increase in temperature. And so you have another buildup of increasing water usage. And so this is from the end of June, and Indianapolis sets a water use record amid drought. And a lovely percentage right here, 40% of the water seen by Citizens Water is used for lawn irrigation. And so that's not even like kind of a common basic human need. It's not related to washing clothes, washing dishes, drinking water, taking showers. Lawn irrigation is simply a cosmetic issue. And so if you look at that 40% of this water use record, combine that with the drought, and the next thing is pretty obvious. All of a sudden you start getting a lot of water restrictions. They start off being voluntary. It's like, please don't water your gardens, especially don't water your yards. And once the voluntary restrictions, if those don't happen, then you move on to the mandatory restrictions. And so even when we got down here to Marion County, declares water shortage warnings, and they actually went around and started ticketing those companies who kept using water sprinklers for their lawn irrigations. And so, once again, why did I kind of talk about droughts in reference to leaking underground storage tanks? Because it makes the public think about their water as a natural resource again. It kind of brings that to the forefront of our minds. It really kind of makes us reconsider how we define a renewable resource. It doesn't mean that it's a limitless supply. It doesn't mean that we can use as much as we want, whenever we want, and there's no problem. It has to be monitored, and so We don't really think about that often, especially in the city, but water companies definitely consider that, and they pay close attention to the droughts. Also makes us consider where our drinking water is coming from. We're so spoiled here in America, we just turn on a faucet and fill our glass and move on. We don't really think about where did that water start off. And so that comes from our reservoirs that tend to shrink during droughts, our rivers and well fields. And then if we look at these, the next thing to keep in mind here is the quality of those sources. Our rivers, I don't think anybody in Indianapolis really wants to go to the White River and take a glass of water and just drink straight from the river. We kind of know that's not a good idea. And so there's a lot of work between a river and a well field and our actual glass of water. And then additionally, as city folk, we still tend to think of wells looking like this. You get your bucket and put it down a well. But it's a highly sophisticated system. And for those of you who don't know, here in Marion County, not here, but in Marion County, we have 7 distinct well fields. And if you ask the average person in Marion County or Indianapolis, they probably have no idea that we have a well field. They don't know what a well field is. Just because if you haven't gotten outside of the city and out in the rural areas, it's just a totally different mindset. And so these little areas marked in blue are the well fields. If you look down here, this is the Perry well field. You can see there's 2 lines. There's kind of a smaller circle here in the middle, and that's our 1-year travel time that we've distinguished. And then the wider circle here is our 5-year travel time. And so that's the extent that we've kind of labeled our well fields in Marion County. You can continue to go out like 10 years, 15 years. You can go even further. But for our county, we kind of just stop at the 1-year and 5-year at this point. And so actually, in Marion County, we enforced a well field ordinance in 1998. And so this is actually a zoning ordinance. And so as businesses want to develop their sites, ever since 1998, they actually have to submit a site and development plan. They have to detail what their process is, what kind of a business it is, and once they actually submit that plan, they have to have somebody come out and visit the site, and it's going to be an actually engineer to come out and assess the site. What are the dangers that could actually contaminate our groundwater? That's the whole point of having the well field ordinance. We want to protect our groundwater, and so we actually go out and have a site visit. And so if you're a business within the well field, there are specific restrictions based on the business. And so gas stations will have different restrictions than a manufacturing site, which will have different from like even just a shopping mall. And so we wanted to have that kind of dependent restrictions, because it does make a difference if you're running different businesses, because there will be different chemicals and hazards associated with that. In addition to the specific restrictions, there are general restrictions that apply to everyone. And the important one here is here in the W1 district, so that's that 1-year travel time. Existing underground storage tanks may be replaced or upgraded, so that's kind of the grandfathered in as far as 1998. But here we say no other new underground storage tanks are permitted in the W1 district. And so we wanted to look at the recent leaking underground storage tanks, because there's definitely a tie-in on what happens with the leaking underground storage tank and why we've actually put this restriction in. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to do a study of kind of the recent underground storage tanks. So we looked at the past 5 years. And so that's kind of where I went with this study. And a lot of it's just kind of collecting numbers and analyzing the data. And so the first thing we wanted to look at that's an interesting distinction is the zoning classification. And so with this restriction of an underground storage tank, clearly there was a lot of pushback from certain industries who felt that they were unnecessarily restricted from placing underground storage tanks. And so those businesses that tend to have those include gas stations, car dealerships, rental agencies who wish to have gasoline stored on site, and then there are some schools as well. And so they felt kind of unnecessarily restricted because if they want to build something new in that 1 year well field, they're not allowed to have an underground storage tank. And so what we did here, with help from the City of Indianapolis and their Department of Metropolitan Development, is that we looked for the zoning classification for Marion County. And so here's a nice pretty map with all the pretty colors. And so we wanted to narrow this down into which areas can you actually build those kind of facilities to begin with. And so first off, we looked at the commercial and then Part 2. I'm not exactly sure how Part 2 is associated, but you'll see here it won't matter too much. And so you can already see that for the county, we've kind of blocked out a good chunk of the county. And so these are the places you can only build those kind of car dealerships and gas stations. So we've severely reduced the available resources there. And now if you just specifically look at the 1 year travel time for the well field, this is how much area that actually is. And so if you look at the available property just to install, or what would likely install an underground storage tank, that adds up to about 350 acres for the entire county of Marion County. And so we're not really trying to restrict a ton of land here. We're not kind of out to prevent commercialization in the area. The goal is to protect our groundwater, and that's really an important factor that we need to remember. And so overall, we're not really trying to isolate certain areas. And so we just thought that was an interesting figure to look at and really look at the numbers. So first off, kind of what is the LUST program? And so again, these are leaking underground storage tanks, and that's actually a program within the Indiana Department of Environmental Management. And so they have their own program for a very specific region. If you look at all the different codes and rules and regulations that even apply to underground storage tanks, it's a lot of code to go through. And so clearly they needed their own program in order to handle that. And one valuable resource that I used a lot is this virtual file cabinet, which is online. And you can actually go in and find IDEM records. It's not just the LUST program, but a lot of IDEM records online. And so you can actually go in, you can search by facility name, if you have an address, you can even put your county in here, and you can search for what sort of IDEM sites are open in your area. And so if you don't know what's going on in your area, or if you're just curious about, you've seen kind of an old gas station and there's a lot of people drilling somewhere, you can actually go in and look and see if there's anything open as far as the IDEM website. And so that's a very valuable resource that I took advantage of. And so as far as the study is concerned and looking at these recent incidents, what were the main questions we wanted to answer? One is, how are these tanks or these incidents discovered? Are they through routine inspections? Are the detection systems notifying the owners and operators that something is wrong? Or is it from construction? Is it when the tank is being removed, all of a sudden they find all this contamination? What's the initial method of discovery? Next, we wanted to look at what areas are being impacted through these incidents. Is it an immediate public health concern? Are people going into facilities and smelling gas and a lot of vapor intrusion, and all of a sudden that's an immediate public concern? Is it affecting our groundwater or well fields? Is it leading to contaminated soil? And then another very interesting aspect is how long. We wanted to know from the time of the initial incident until the tanks are kind of out of the LUST program. What's the length of time? How much time does it take to go through this whole remediation process? So these days, months, years, is there kind of an average amount of time to go through the program? And so those are kind of the main highlights we want to look at. And so here we looked at Marion County, and each of these little green dots represent an incident that occurred. And the time frame we used here was January 2007 to April of this year. And we picked April mainly because that's when we decided to start the study, so we stopped there. And so for that range of time, there were 146 incidents. And you can see that they're fairly spread out through the county. You can find certain major roadways and follow them, kind of like 16th Street here has a whole range of them. Our favorite, Keystone Avenue, which is close to the health department, actually has quite a few incidents. So you can kind of see where the larger commercial areas are located. Another interesting point here is that 10 sites actually had more than one incident, which really won't show up on the map. And so they'll be overlaid on top of each other. And so you could almost consider those possibly like trouble sites, or is there some reason why some sites have more incidents than others? And then since I knew I was going to be coming to IEHA here, we decided to look just to count how many incidents happened around the state. And so here we have a map, and here's kind of the numbers in a little color scale. There are a few counties that don't have any. Who knows why that is? It might be because it's small, or who knows why some places get lucky to not have any. But you can see that nearly every county has an incident of some sort. And so, especially if you're not in a larger city, are you aware that you have these leaking underground storage tanks in your county? And once again, you can kind of find the major cities, obviously Indianapolis, and then up here in the Chicagoland area. You can almost follow the interstates as well, which makes sense because that's where you're going to have kind of your gas stations, which is the large majority of underground storage tanks. And so we just thought that was an interesting fact that nobody's really isolated from these kind of incidents. They happen all over, and there's something we need to be aware of, especially if you have a leaking tank. Do you know if it's close to a school? Is it close to somebody's well? Especially in rural areas where it might be a little difficult to find out where all the wells are located, and there's a lot more of them. So those are things you definitely need to be considered. Here's one of the incident reports that I used a lot. And so this is an official IDEM initial incident report form. And so very important to notice here, it's only 2 pages. And so it only collects a very kind of narrow amount of information. And it's the very first thing that they fill out once they find out about it. And so you can see it consists of a lot of checkboxes, which is actually helpful for data analysis because it makes things a lot easier. But keep in mind when you see some of these graphs and everything, it's kind of like the first assessment of the site. And as the problem persists, a lot of people get more information, and a lot of that data shifts a little bit. And so some of the graphs will be very representative of what happens, but just keep in mind that a lot of things are found out kind of later on throughout the process. But this is kind of the best source that we could have to get a lot of information quickly to cover all these incidents. So this is the main form that I used for my study. So first question we wanted to look at was the method of discovery. And that's important because recently there's been a lot of new technology and safety measures that have been implemented and required for underground storage tanks to employ to protect these sites from leaking. So a lot of things have secondary containment, inventory control, alarm systems. These are supposed to be measures that will help the owners and operators be aware that there's actually a leak occurring. And so all of these methods are supposed to prevent kind of unknown things happening. And so we wanted to see, does the data follow that? Are these things actually working correctly? And actually from the study, it seems about 50% of the incidents are discovered by what I call accident. And so that basically means here we have 11% were discovered during phase 2 investigation. And so the phase 2 investigations occur usually when the property is changing hands and they're actually looking for problems. And again, here 40% are discovered when the tank was actually removed or some other construction process on site that kind of accidentally stumbled upon this contamination. So we're still missing 50% here that should be caught using these safety measures. And so we've talked to some different people, and they can't really understand why some of these are just not working as well as we would like them to. So it's something to keep in mind if people are kind of pushing the technology, which is something we definitely want to keep improving, but they're not perfect, and so you still have to be very aware that these things will occur without notification at all. Here's a graph showing the different spill source, and so again, this is from one of those checkbox lines on that report. And so we want to know, where is the spill coming from? So we have here like the tank, piping, hose, dispenser, other, which could be a lot of different things. And then of course we have this last category here, is not indicated. And so that's about 50% are not indicated. So that's kind of an important number to pay attention to. That could mean that somebody actually checked the box not indicated, or they didn't check anything at all. And so that could come from a lot of different things. And it's important to realize this information is not all being captured in these reports. And that could be important if you're really trying to improve the safety measures, if you want to know where the weak spots are on these systems. If you're not kind of getting all the data that you really need to, you can't really move forward without all the information. And so it's just kind of something that's not being captured. And then if we look at the cause, the spill cause, that number goes up even further to 86%. And so the cause could be physical mechanical damage, corrosion, spill. I think one problem with this category, the cause in that initial report, is I imagine a lot of people just don't know. If they come across the site and they're like, oh, there's contamination, I know it kind of came from over here, but it could be another few months before they actually figure out what happened. And so this initial report is not going to be updated, like retrofit type. And so they're not going to go back and fix the initial report to update that information. And so, again, it's just something to be aware of with these numbers. But they are trying to collect some of this data, but sometimes it's difficult. The next question we wanted to look at was the source. Like, what is being contaminated from these leaking underground storage tanks? And so, of course, the big factor we wanted to look at was groundwater. And so this is the same map with the same incident locations. But now each of these red dots indicates a site that has groundwater contamination. And so according to the initial reports, about 30% of the incidents resulted in groundwater contamination. And you can see, again, here there's no real kind of pattern to it, which kind of makes sense. But those of us who are kind of familiar with leaking underground storage tanks, we actually thought this number was actually pretty good. Like, we were kind of happy that it was only 30%. And so what we wanted to do is go back and look at the current status of the incidents, because that's another factor where once you kind of investigate the site a little more, you find more and more contamination. So we did an updated map, and that number jumped up here to almost double. And so this is kind of a bit more realistic of what we expected. And so you can see there's a lot more red dots now. And the other thing to be worried about are these dots that are located where the well fields are. And so you have leaking underground storage tanks that are contaminating the groundwater in a well field protected area. And so that's something we definitely want to pay attention to. So I know it's going to be very hard to read this, and so I'm just going to kind of highlight some of the process, the lust closure process. And so this is from the IDEM remediation program guide, because the next phase of the study was kind of to look at the timeline. We wanted to figure out how long it takes from beginning to end. And so I'm going to kind of highlight the big stages and where it kind of propagates further. And so you have the initial notification. The owner-operator finds the spill. They notify IDEM. And here's where that initial report is filled out. That's where that 2-page report that we were collecting a lot of our information is. That's right here. And so it goes through a process to make sure it actually is a spill. If it is, we go further down. And so the next big stage here is kind of right down here. It's the initial site characterization report. And so once the leaking underground storage tank is discovered, they have to process the site. And so there's a big hang up right here because it takes time to process the site. You have to go through, the responsible party has to hire a contractor, and then the contractor has to investigate, and they submit a report to IDEM. IDEM has to approve it. If it's not approved, then they have to go back through that whole cycle. And so it just takes time. It's the way the process works. And so this is kind of that one big phase that we know it takes a lot of time. And so we wanted to see how far along we get caught up right here. And then once the site is actually characterized, then they have to come up with a plan. And so we move up here to the corrective action plan. And here's another section that kind of gets it propagated almost indefinitely, it feels like sometimes, where it has to be approved. And so again, the contractor has to submit to IDEM. IDEM has to send it back if it's not what they want. And so this is kind of the next big stage with the corrective action plan. And then once the plan is approved, then you have to implement the plan. And so, and that's pretty much all the way down to here. And so once the plan is approved, then we implement the plan. And once it's completed and to IDEM's approval, then we can actually close the site. And so we wanted to see where kind of these major hang-ups were and how long that takes. And so as far as the site characterization, here's some of the things they look at. They want to know the mass of the contaminant. What is it? Where is it? How much is it? They want to look at exposure pathways. And so is the site leading to vapor intrusion? Is it going to be traveling in the groundwater? Soil saturation. And then another important part here is preferential pathways. How is the contamination going to move if it does? And so what it's going to do is it's going to kind of find the path of least resistance. And sometimes those are utility lines and sewers. And so when you're installing these utility lines and systems, what you do is after you lay the pipe, you add a bunch of backfill, which is going to be a lot more loose material than the possible surrounding soil and clay material. And so instead of the contamination kind of continuing through the more dense soil, it's going to find these easy pathways and just travel along there. And so that's part of the site characterization process. They have to go through the entire facility or the location site and map out where all these things are located. Another example here is a stream bed where any sand and gravel. So they really have to look at the geology of the site and understand what's going on, which is difficult, again, because here we're trying to look at something that we can't see. And so this process just simply takes time. And so again, highlighting these important stages, that corrective action plan. Delay may be from site characterization. And again, here's where we want to eliminate the exposure pathway, because the whole intent here is to prevent the contamination from reaching public health. That's kind of the barrier they want to overcome. And so we're looking at, is it source removal? Is it just simply digging up dirt and disposing of it? Or is it putting in monitoring wells or vapor mitigation? And so it could be all of these, any combination of these, depending on what the site is. So there's lots of analysis involved there. Then the other important date that everybody looks to go to is this no further action. So that's when they close the site. And so that's basically when everything's done. And so how long does it take to get there? In reality, there's kind of a large variability for what that means. And a lot of that depends on the site. Another difficult thing we have to realize is that oftentimes there's a lot of prioritizing involved. And so sometimes you don't kind of get to where you really want it to be because there's bigger fish to fry, and you kind of have to understand that and accept it. And that's sometimes very difficult for us to do. And so now, we'll look at some more graphs here. So here, time frame here, we're looking at years from the initial incident into that CAP approval. And so this kind of really encompasses how long a site investigation may last. And this is actually a pretty nice little curve. It centers really well here in this 2 to 2.5 years. And so if you remember, my initial graph here, or my initial map, had 146 incidents. And so this little graph here is only based on 13. And so there's a couple reasons. Sometimes it hasn't gotten to this phase yet, or there are quite a few cases that actually skipped this phase. And those tend to be the very short duration incidents. And so things that can get cleaned up or remediated within 6 months to a year kind of skip this phase because it's probably an easy cleanup. A lot of it's a simple site, and so they don't have to go through this CAP approval. So not every site that goes through the lust remediation has to get an approval, but it's kind of a stepping stone. And here you can kind of see that here. And so this is the incident to the no further action. And so you can see that there's a huge chunk that's here in this 0 to a year time. And so these probably are indicative of those simple cleanups that would not require a CAP approval. And so, because after that year or so, then we kind of start leveling out. And it pretty much takes up to 4 to 4.5 years. If I had a longer study, it would probably be a longer graph. And so it's only a 5-year study, so it's kind of limited there. And here we have a kind of a bigger array. So here we have this 52 cases. And so of those 52, not all of them got CAP approvals. But again, here we have about an average of 1.7 years. So I kind of showed the graphs with the CAP approval and then the no further action, but those are only a chunk of them. And so what we did as of May 15th, we went through and looked at kind of where are they now? What's the current status of those 146 incidents in the past 5.5 years? And so here we can see 11 and 2% here account for deactivated or discontinued. And so deactivated basically means there was a spill reported and they filled out an incident report, but once they investigated a little further, it didn't really fall under that categorization. And so they basically deactivated it from the LUST program. It probably went somewhere else. A discontinued usually means that the contamination is most likely from a previous incident, and so instead of creating a new incident, they just kind of tacked it on the end of another one. A small section here is referred. A lot of that is to state cleanup. And then we get into our kind of 3 categories that we were talking about. The no further action, so here's that 32% from that last graph. Here we're in kind of the second phase. There's a CAP approval, but they're not in no further action. So this is kind of the remediation phase. They're implementing that CAP approval. Here's kind of the scary number, the 50%. So 50% of those 146 incidents haven't even made it to the CAP approval stage yet. And so that's most likely means it's kind of stuck in that site characterization phase. And so that's kind of something definitely to be aware of, that they haven't even made it kind of to the first major step. And this 50% doesn't really mean those are the most recent. And so if we take that 50% and show a time duration here, those 50% is spread out throughout the entire 5-year study. It doesn't mean that all of those 50% happened within the past 6 months and they just haven't had enough time. Again, some of them are very recent and some have started when the study began. And there's not really a whole lot of pattern here. So the average is 2.4 years. The study was like a 5-year study. So basically it just means I stopped the study at 5.5 years, and who knows how long this would extend. And so our study here with the Marion County is a small data set, kind of a small time frame. We wanted to know, is that kind of typical for the country, or is that kind of like an extreme case? Is that like the worst case scenario, best case scenario? Where do we fall as far as the country? And so what I did was I compared it to a national EPA report that was submitted and approved in 2011. And so what they did is they took a group of states, It's like 14 to 15 states. And they basically did the same kind of study that I did with Marion County. And they looked at a lot of these same graphs, and so we're going to compare. And so it's 14 states, a lot bigger set of data, and they looked at like 20 plus years. And so it has a much longer time frame. And so first here is that age distribution. And so how long have these cases been open? And so here we go from 0 to 5 years all the way up to 20 plus years. And so you can see this is a much broader scale here, and this average would be much higher in kind of the 15-year range average. And so this really just showcases how long it takes the time to clean up or remediate some of these sites. Here again, what stage of cleanup are they in? And so this confirmed release, that's kind of the initial reporting stage. And so we have about a quarter that we're in the confirmed release. Site assessment, so same thing as that site characterization phase. And so another 30% or so are in that site assessment, and then 45% are in remediation phase. And so this is slightly better pie graph than the one I showed for Marion County, but it's also a 20 plus year study, and so we would expect more sites to be in the remediation phase rather than the initial site assessment. It would be interesting to see a pie graph of this study from the 5 most recent years. Would that pie graph kind of look more similar to the Marion County pie graph? Here again is if you break down each of those phases, how long are the incidents in those phases? Again, it just takes a long time. A lot of these sites have been 20 years. Some really do take only 0 to 5 years. Like sometimes it's very quickly, sometimes it takes a long time. And then this is another very depressing pie graph. Media contaminated. So as the soil, vapor intrusion, groundwater. Here's that groundwater. Is 78% of the leaking underground storage tank contaminate the groundwater. And so that's something definitely to be aware of, especially if you're in a community that has a lot of wells and you really rely on groundwater more heavily than others. These leaking tanks are definitely something to be concerned with. And so as far as kind of comparison of Marion County with the country, Indiana's pretty kind of standard. Like it's not the best case, worst case. We're par for the course. Big thing here, it takes a lot of time to clean up these less sites. And so if you take that into consideration and remember that map I showed of groundwater contaminated sites in a well field, some of those are in the 1-year well field, 5-year well fields. If these sites are taking 10, 15, 20 years to clean up, that basically means they're contaminating the drinking water. And so that's definitely something to be concerned about. And basically here, they're contaminating the groundwater. The data shows that. It takes time to clean it up. And so that's why in that well field ordinance, in that 1-year wellhead, we said no more new underground storage tanks. There's reason we did that. The data shows that they're dangerous to our groundwater, and so we want to protect our groundwater. From that study, EPA has a lot of steps forward. They're looking to update their code, and I'm not going to read all this, but a lot of it's training for the owners and operators, maintenance, a lot more things. They're just trying to catch these things quicker. And then conclusions, kind of based on the study I did, me and my department. One thing is a lot of these sites are discovered by accident. The safety measures are not necessarily working as well as we want them to. There is still some missing information from those initial reports. And so this is kind of one study looking at those initial reports. It'd be interesting to see a study of kind of the final report. It would be easier if the final report was a nice checklist, but it's not. And so we're not really kind of getting all the data that we'd like to get, and that's just the way life is sometimes. Big one, I need to update this from the 30% to 57.5% impacting the groundwater. And then the impact of time. It's such an issue here that it's taking time to get to these approval stages. 50% of the newest incidents haven't even got to that stage yet. And our kind of whole point of looking at this study was to see how these things are affecting our well field. And so, special thanks. Pam is the one that initially wrapped me into this program and this study. Rosie, definitely, she did a lot of studying with the IDEM and looking up dates and everything. Brooke Thomas, she's from the Department of Metropolitan Development. She made all those, or she helped me get all those pretty maps with the zoning. Tim Veach also helped with some of the IDEM data. And then thank you all for listening. So, any questions? I talked really fast. Feeling good? Yeah.
Those tanks are abandoned tanks. Are they just places that went out of business and gone?
Not necessarily. Like some of the ones at construction, they were installing new piping or something, and in the process of installing new stuff, they discovered stuff that was sitting there, and so it's not necessarily abandoned sites.
But some of them are?
Yeah, some of them are. Yeah, I don't have what those...
That would be interesting to know.
Yeah, I don't think that's
we
on
have
that.
that one, we do anything. Gas stations aren't there anymore.
Yeah, in Marion County, a lot of them are more recent because they're not abandoned.
I would say the preponderance are active stations. And these are all upgraded tanks that meet federal regulations.
Right.
So
Yeah.
do not ever believe them when they say
It's a brand new
it's a
tank.
foolproof system.
Yeah, and it's a
There
brand
is
new
no
tank. They
foolproof
use that
system.
all the time. You know, it's brand new tanks.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
That's why we wanted to do the most, like the 5-year study. We wanted to keep it short because all of those tanks should have been upgraded to that 1998 standard. So a lot of those are the newer ones that should have all of the safety measures implemented at that point. That's why we wanted to keep it kind of short and kind of not include some of those really old tanks. Any other questions?
Are there any fees associated with that ordinance?
Not really.
People?
No, and so, yeah, it's kind of a touchy subject in our department anyways, as far as kind of keeping that in line, and there's a lot of pushback from kind of the industry side of it. They obviously don't like the ordinance, and so no fees associated at this point. We wish there were.
Well, I can kind of add to
I
that.
was like-
The businesses don't pay fees, but the water utilities, they have to feed some money into a fund that pays for the engineers and stuff like that. But the businesses themselves don't have to pay for it.
Yeah, so it eventually comes back to people who pay for the water, so everybody. We
Yeah.
end up paying more to clean up any contamination.
There is kind of, they don't pay a fee for what Amanda was talking about, but there are only two ways to do well field protection. You can do a zoning ordinance or you can do a health ordinance. Politically, when we did that ordinance, letting the health department do it wasn't an option. It wasn't going to happen. The benefit to the community that they saw of having it be a zoning ordinance is that by law in the state of Indiana, zoning laws may not be retroactive. They can affect only new construction. So in Marion County, that zoning overlay ordinance, the hook into the system is when you go to apply for an improvement location permit, essentially a building permit. There is a fee associated with that, but it's one that you would pay anyway to get your building permit. And that goes to the Department of Code Enforcement. It doesn't even come to us.
We don't get that.
No, we don't get that. And so there is a fee for that building permit, but the well field review is just a part of that. So there isn't an additional fee for that, for the well field review.
Any other questions? All right, thank you.